$50. A rounding error. A crumpled bill lost in the cushions of a luxury sedan. For Vivian Croft, cutting it from the payroll was an involuntary reflex, a minor stroke of a silver-plated pen. She didn't look at Arthur's grease-stained hands when she did it. She didn't smell the cheap baby formula lingering on his frayed jacket. She just saw a red cell on a spreadsheet. By Friday, that $50 saving would cost her an empire and her dignity. Fluorescent lights buzzed with a sick, erratic rhythm in the sub-basement of the Croft Core building. Down here, the air tasted like copper and old dust. It was a stark contrast to the 94th floor, where the air was filtered, temperature-controlled, and smelled faintly of eucalyptus. Vivian stood in the doorway of the boiler room, the sharp heels of her Louboutins sinking slightly into the rubberized safety matting. She hated the basement. It was loud, chaotic, and smelled of human exertion. But mostly she hated inefficiencies, and the quarterly audit clutched in her manicured hand was bleeding them. Arthur. Her voice didn't echo. It sliced. Underneath a tangle of rusted pipes that predated the tech boom by 3 decades, a man shifted. A heavy wrench clanged against the concrete. Arthur pulled himself out on a plastic creeper board. He was 50, maybe 55, with deep grooves carved around his mouth and eyes that looked like they hadn't seen a full night's sleep since the Clinton administration. He smelled heavily of industrial bleach and the faint, sweet scent of discount baby lotion. His knuckles were raw, split from the cold and the work. "Ms. Croft," he said, wiping a streak of black grease from his forehead with the back of a calloused wrist. He didn't scramble to his feet. His knees popped audibly as he stood, a slow, painful sound that made Vivian's mouth tighten in disgust. "I'm reviewing the maintenance logs for this month," she said. She didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed locked on the tablet screen. "You claimed 2 hours of unauthorized overtime last Tuesday, $50.12. Care to explain why my budget is leaking?" Arthur blinked. The harsh lighting caught the grey in his stubble. "The primary chiller for the server farm, ma'am. The condensation line backed up. It was leaking onto the main power relay. I had to stay to patch the valve, or the racks would have shorted out." Vivian tapped a manicured nail against the screen. Click, click. "There is a protocol for emergency repairs, Arthur. You log a ticket. You wait for the shift supervisor to approve the overtime. You do not unilaterally decide to steal company time." "Steal?" The word hung in the damp air. Arthur looked at his hands. They were trembling, just a little. Not from fear, but from a bone-deep exhaustion. He had a 4-year-old daughter at home with a respiratory infection, a babysitter charging him by the hour, and a bank account overdrawn by $14. "Ma'am, if I waited for a ticket, the servers would have fried. The patch took 2 hours because the threads on the old pipe are stripped. Excuses are just inefficiencies dressed in emotion," Vivian replied evenly. It was a line from her best-selling management book. Hearing it spoken aloud, down here in the damp, it sounded incredibly hollow. But Vivian believed it. She breathed in measured intervals, treating oxygen like a finite corporate asset. "You violated protocol. You circumvented the approval matrix for a $50 payout. If I let the janitorial staff write their own paychecks, this company would bleed out in a week." "I'm the only overnight technician," Arthur said, his voice dropping. A quiet desperation leaked into his tone. "I'm just trying to keep the lights on. And I'm trying to run a multi-billion-dollar enterprise." Vivian locked the tablet. The screen went black. "You're terminated, Arthur. Effective immediately. Clean out your locker. Security will escort you off the premises." Arthur didn't scream. He didn't throw his wrench. He just stood there, the fight draining out of him so fast it was almost hard to watch. His shoulders slumped, pulling his posture inward until he looked small, brittle. "My health insurance," he whispered. "My little girl. She has asthma. Her inhalers." "Cobra paperwork will be mailed to you," Vivian interrupted, turning on her heel. The conversation was over. "Leave your company-issued tools at the security desk." She walked away, the click-clack of her heels perfectly rhythmic. She felt a brief, microscopic twinge of guilt, but pushed it down immediately. The spreadsheet was balanced. The leak was plugged. Metal lockers slammed in the distance, but Arthur's row was dead quiet. The locker room smelled of stale sweat, cheap aerosol deodorant, and damp wool. He unbuttoned his blue uniform shirt, the fabric stiff with dried sweat and grime. Peeling it off felt like shedding a second skin, one he had worn for 9 years. Underneath, his undershirt was yellowed at the collar. He folded the uniform neatly, a habit ingrained from a lifetime of trying to respect things that didn't belong to him, and placed it on the wooden bench. Inside his locker, there wasn't much. A tube of generic muscle rub, a half-eaten pack of antacids, and taped to the inside of the dented grey door was a Polaroid of Lily. She was missing her 2 front teeth, smiling broadly around a sticky red popsicle. There was a thumbprint on the glossy paper where Arthur touched it every night before his shift. He carefully peeled the tape away, slipping the photo into his battered leather wallet. Then he reached to the bottom of the locker. Wrapped in an oily rag was a small, solid brass pressure regulator valve. It wasn't company property. 3 months ago, the main coolant line for the legacy servers, the ones housing the proprietary algorithm that Croft Core was built on, had started shuddering. The company's procurement department had denied his request for a replacement valve, citing a pending vendor review that never happened. So Arthur had gone to a local hardware store, spent $42 of his own grocery money, and installed it himself to stop the system from shaking itself apart. "Leave your company-issued tools at the security desk." Arthur stared at the brass valve. He wasn't a vindictive man. He didn't want to burn the building down. He was just so incredibly, overwhelmingly tired. Tired of fixing things that nobody cared about. Tired of being treated like a piece of broken machinery. He walked back to the boiler room. It was empty. The chillers hummed their steady, rhythmic thrum. Arthur stepped up to the main coolant manifold. With his own personal wrench, a heavy, scuffed craftsman he'd owned since he was 20, he reached in and unscrewed the brass regulator he had bought. Water hissed. A few drops of freezing condensation hit his wrist. He quickly swapped in the old, stripped plastic valve the company had originally provided, the one that didn't fit quite right. The pipes immediately gave a low, groaning shudder, but the water held. For now. Arthur slipped his brass valve into his pocket. It weighed heavy against his thigh. 10 minutes later, he walked out of the glass-fronted lobby into the biting November rain. The security guard, a kid named Davis who always shared his leftover pizza, wouldn't look him in the eye as he took his keycard. The doors slid shut with a soft, final hiss. Arthur stood on the wet concrete, the rain soaking instantly through his thin windbreaker. A bus rumbled past, splashing grey water onto the curb. He checked his phone. 3:15 a.m., $14 in his account. He had to tell Lily they were having pancakes for dinner again. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat tasting like bile and defeat. Miles above him, in a penthouse suite encased in floor-to-ceiling glass, Vivian poured herself a glass of 20-year-old Macallan. She stood looking out over the city grid, a sprawling web of lights that she felt she controlled. She took a sip. It burned perfectly. She didn't think about Arthur. She thought about the Japanese investors arriving in exactly 30 hours to buy her company for $4 billion. Everything was perfect. The spreadsheet was clean. Morning broke over the city, not with sunlight, but with a suffocating, humid greyness. By 9 a.m. the following Tuesday, the Croft Core executive boardroom was a theatre of high-stakes corporate warfare. Vivian sat at the head of a sprawling mahogany table, her posture rigid, a forced smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Her silk blouse was crisp, her hair immaculately pulled back. Across from her sat the acquisition team from Takahashi Industries. They were quiet, calculating men who spoke in low tones and scrutinized every metric. The value of Croft Core, Vivian projected, her voice ringing with practiced authority, lies in our predictive algorithm. It operates on a legacy framework that we've perfectly insulated. It processes 10 million microtransactions a second without a single thermal delay. Mr. Sato, the lead investor, steepled his fingers. Thermal stability is our primary concern, Ms. Croft. Your infrastructure is housed in a building constructed in 1988. We need to see the live stress test. Of course, Vivian said smoothly. My IT director, Greg, will initialize the simulation now. She nodded to Greg, a pale, nervous man sitting at the side console. He tapped a sequence of keys. On the massive OLED screen behind Vivian, a series of green bars appeared, representing the server load. 80 floors below, in the sub-basement, the old plastic valve on the primary chiller gave another violent shudder. The threads, stripped and worn, slipped a fraction of a millimeter. The coolant flow choked. In the boardroom, a single green bar on the screen flickered, then turned yellow. Vivian's smile remained frozen, but her eyes snapped to Greg. "What is that?" she mouthed. Greg's fingers flew across his keyboard. A sheen of sweat broke out on his forehead, catching the glare of the recessed lighting. "Just a minor telemetry lag," he stammered to the room, forcing a chuckle. "The servers are spooling up," he typed frantically. An error code popped up on his private monitor. ERR_TEMP_CRITICAL_SECTOR_4. Sector 4 was the legacy vault. "Greg," Vivian said, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave, taking on a dangerous edge. "Show them the processing speed." I can't," Greg whispered. He looked up, his face entirely drained of blood. "The servers are throttling down to protect the hard drives. The ambient temperature in the vault is rising, fast." Sato leaned forward, frowning. "Your telemetry says the server room is currently at 82 degrees. Is this correct?" "That's impossible," Vivian snapped, dropping the facade. She pulled up her own tablet, the same tablet she had used to fire Arthur. She opened the facility's dashboard. The numbers were ticking upward in real time. 83, 85, 88. Red warnings began to cascade across her screen. The mainframe was overheating. If it hit 100 degrees, the physical drives would warp, melting the very algorithm she was trying to sell. "Core maintenance," Vivian hissed into her smartwatch. "Now." "I did," Greg choked out. "The new daytime contractors are down there. They don't know what to do. They said the schematics don't match the plumbing. There's a missing regulator valve on the main chiller. The system is cannibalizing itself." Vivian felt a cold drop of sweat slide down her spine, soaking into the expensive silk of her blouse. She remembered the dark, damp boiler room. She remembered the heavy wrench, the grease. "I had to stay to patch the valve, or the racks would have shorted out." "Get him," Vivian ordered, her voice trembling slightly. The investors were watching her now, murmuring amongst themselves in Japanese. "Get the night technician." "Pendleton?" Greg asked, frantically clicking his mouse. "He was terminated last week. By you." The room temperature was perfectly controlled at 68 degrees, but Vivian felt like she was suffocating. The OLED screen behind her flashed a blinding, aggressive crimson. A synthesized voice from the console announced quietly, "Warning. Core temperature exceeding safety parameters. Automatic shutdown in 10 minutes to prevent catastrophic data loss." "Get him on the phone," Vivian commanded, ignoring Sato's rising voice. She stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. The polished veneer of the Billionaire CEO was cracking, peeling away to reveal a desperate, panicked woman. "Offer him double his rate. Tell him to get down here right now." Greg dialed. The room fell dead silent, save for the ringing of a phone over the speaker. Ring, ring, ring. "Hello?" A gravelly, exhausted voice answered. In the background, a child was coughing a wet, rattling cough. "Arthur," Vivian said, leaning over the table, abandoning all pretense of corporate stoicism. "This is Vivian Croft. We have an emergency with the legacy chiller. I need you in the building immediately. I'll pay you whatever you want." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the sound of a spoon clinking against a ceramic bowl. "I can't, Ms. Croft," Arthur said simply. He didn't sound smug. He didn't sound victorious. He just sounded tired. "I don't work for you anymore, and I have to take my daughter to the free clinic. We're having pancakes." "Arthur, the servers are going to melt," she shouted, her voice shrill, cracking in the middle of the boardroom. The Japanese investors stared in open shock. "I'll give you $10,000. You fired me for 50, Arthur replied. "The part you need is a 3/4-inch brass pressure regulator. Costs about $40 at Home Depot. But you can't install it while the system is hot. You have to shut the whole building's power grid down first." "Shut it down," Greg gasped. "That will wipe the volatile memory, the presentation." "Good luck, Ms. Croft," Arthur said. The line went dead. Panic tasted cold, like biting down on a piece of tin foil. Vivian stood frozen at the head of the mahogany table, the dead dial tone echoing through the boardroom speakers. The silence that followed was heavier than the humid air suffocating the room. Mr. Hayes, the lead partner for Belmont Acquisitions, didn't shout. He didn't express outrage. He simply unclasped his gold fountain pen, capped it with a soft click, and slipped it into the breast pocket of his tailored suit. That small metallic sound was the loudest thing Vivian had ever heard. It was the sound of $4 billion evaporating. "Ms. Croft," Hayes said, his voice flat, devoid of the warm, sycophantic tone he had used over dinner the night before. "Belmont Partners invests in stability. We do not invest in infrastructure that can be crippled by a single, disgruntled maintenance worker. We will pause our due diligence until you have a functional product to sell." He stood up. His team stood up in unison. They didn't look at the massive OLED screen flashing violent red warnings. They didn't look at Vivian. They walked out, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind them, sealing Vivian and Greg in a room that suddenly felt like a tomb. "Ms. Croft," Greg whispered. His face was the color of spoiled milk. He was staring at his tablet. Sector 4 just crossed 95 degrees. The failsafe will cut the power in exactly 6 minutes to stop electrical fires. When that happens, the liquid cooling pumps die. The residual heat trapped in the server racks will bake the hard drives. The algorithm, it'll be corrupted, irrecoverable. Vivian snapped out of her paralysis. The cold panic vanished, replaced by a searing, frantic adrenaline. She didn't issue a command. She turned and ran. She sprinted out of the boardroom, her heels digging into the plush carpet. Greg scrambled after her, clutching his tablet like a shield. She bypassed the executive elevator, slamming her hand against the call button for the service car. It arrived with a slow, agonizing grind, 94 floors down. The descent felt like falling. Vivian watched the digital numbers tick backward, her chest heaving, the pristine silk of her blouse sticking to her ribs. She calculated the losses. It wasn't just the Belmont deal. If the core algorithm corrupted, Croft Core's stock would plummet at the opening bell. Client contracts would trigger breach clauses. The empire she had built ruthlessly, meticulously, cell by cell on spreadsheets, was unraveling because of a piece of brass. The elevator doors chimed and slid open to the sub-basement. Heat hit them like a physical blow. It wasn't just warm, it was thick, wet, and smelled aggressively of ozone, melting plastic and hot dust. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered erratically, casting sickly, strobe-like shadows across the concrete walls. "Miller!" Vivian screamed, stumbling out of the elevator. Down the corridor, in the boiler room, 3 men in pristine yellow hard hats were standing in a puddle of water, staring at a massive tangle of pipes. They were daytime contractors. They charged $200 an hour, and they were absolutely useless. Vivian splashed into the room. The dirty, rust-colored water soaked instantly into her $1,200 Louboutin, ruining the leather, seeping into her stockings. She didn't care. She shoved past a heavily tattooed contractor holding a schematic. "Fix it," she demanded, pointing a trembling finger at the primary chiller manifold. The main coolant pipe was vibrating violently, producing a high-pitched mechanical shriek that made Vivian's teeth ache. Steam hissed from a jagged joint where a cheap, white plastic valve was threaded onto heavy iron. Water was spraying in a fine, hot mist, pooling on the floor and running dangerously close to the main electrical conduit. Miller, the crew foreman, held his hands up defensively. "Lady, we can't touch that. The whole system is pressurized. Someone yanked the custom regulator. If we try to tighten that plastic piece while the pump is pushing 200 psi, it'll blow and we'll take scalding water straight to the face." "Shut the pump off," Greg yelled over the noise, wiping a mix of condensation and sweat from his glasses. "I can't," Miller yelled back. "The bypass valve is seized. It's rusted shut. Only way to kill the pressure is to cut the main breaker to the building. But your IT guy here says if we kill the power, the servers fry anyway." Vivian stared at the plastic valve. It was slipping. She could literally see the threads giving way, millimeter by millimeter, pushed outward by the immense pressure of the boiling system. "There has to be a way," Vivian gasped, stepping closer to the hissing pipe. The heat radiating from it was intense, prickling her skin. "I just need it to hold for 10 minutes, just long enough for Greg to migrate the core data to the cloud." "You need a 3/4-inch brass pressure regulator," Miller said grimly, reading off his tablet. "And you need a guy who knows how to hot swap it without bleeding the line. I don't have that part, and I don't have a guy crazy enough to try it." Vivian remembered Arthur's voice on the phone. "The part you need is a 3/4-inch brass pressure regulator. Costs about $40 at Home Depot." She looked at her hands. They were manicured, soft, unblemished. They had never built anything physical. They had only ever pointed, signed, and dismissed. Driven by a blind, desperate impulse, she reached out toward the plastic valve, thinking she could just hold it together, just physically force the machinery to obey her will. "Don't touch that," Miller barked. Her palm closed around the plastic. It was blisteringly hot. A jet of pressurized steam shot out from the side, slicing across her wrist. Vivian shrieked, recoiling violently. She stumbled backward, her ruined heel catching on the rubber safety matting, and collapsed into the dirty, lukewarm water pooling on the concrete. Pain flared up her arm, sharp and immediate. She grabbed her wrist, gasping for air. The skin was already turning angry red. Greg dropped to his knees beside her, his hands hovering uselessly. "Miss Croft? Vivian, are you okay?" She didn't answer. She sat in the filthy water, her tailored skirt soaked, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat and steam, clutching her burned wrist. She looked up at the labyrinth of iron and steel above her. It was indifferent to her money. It was deaf to her authority. It operated on physics, pressure, and maintenance. Above the shrieking of the pipe, a synthetic voice echoed from Greg's tablet, muffled by the chaos. Warning, core temperature at 98 degrees, 2 minutes to critical failure. Vivian pulled her phone from her soaked jacket pocket. Her fingers were shaking so badly she dropped it once into the puddle. She snatched it up, smearing greasy water across the screen, and navigated to her recent calls. She pressed Arthur's number. It went straight to voicemail. "Arthur," she sobbed into the speaker, the sound of her own breaking voice foreign to her ears. The arrogant, untouchable CEO was gone. She was just a terrified woman sitting in a puddle. "Arthur, please, I'm begging you. I'm sitting in the basement. I burned my hand. The contractors don't know what to do. I'll give you your job back. I'll give you a pension. I'll give you anything. Please, please come back." She sent the message. And then she sat in the dirt, listening to her empire scream. Plastic chairs in free municipal clinics were designed to punish the poor. Arthur was convinced of this. They were molded from a rigid, unforgiving polymer that dug into the lower back, and they were always covered in a faint, sticky film that smelled vaguely of ammonia and old lollipops. He sat rigid, his heavy work boots resting on the scuffed linoleum. In his lap, Lily was curled into a tight ball, her head resting against his chest. She was 4 years old, but right now she felt weightless. Every time she breathed, a wet, rattling wheeze echoed in her small chest, vibrating against Arthur's ribs. Her skin was flushed, radiating a dry, uncomfortable heat. "Daddy," she murmured, her voice scratchy. "I'm here, Bug," Arthur said softly, resting his large, rough hand against her forehead. His knuckles still stung from the cold air outside. "Just a little longer. Doctor's going to give you the good medicine." The clinic was packed. A man with a bloody rag wrapped around his hand paced near the water cooler. A young mother rocked a screaming infant. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a sickly, yellow cast, completely unlike the crisp, bright white lights of the Croft Core lobby. Here, time moved like thick mud. Arthur's right thigh vibrated. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen was cracked across the top corner, a spiderweb of shattered glass he hadn't been able to afford to fix. The caller ID flashed, V. Croft. He stared at the name. A dull ache throbbed behind his eyes. He didn't answer. He let it buzz until the screen went dark. He wasn't a malicious man. When he had unthreaded that brass valve in the middle of the night, he hadn't done it with a maniacal grin. He had done it with a heavy heart, feeling profoundly, utterly empty. He had bought that part with money he needed for groceries because he took pride in his work. He had cared for those massive groaning machines like they were his own. When Vivian Croft fired him, when she looked through him like he was a stain on the floor, something inside him had simply snapped. He just wanted his property back. But sitting here, surrounded by the coughing and the waiting, the reality of what he had done settled over him. He knew exactly what was happening in that sub-basement right now. He knew the sound the primary manifold made when it was starving for coolant. He knew the exact smell of the ozone baking off the server racks. His phone buzzed again. A notification popped up. New voicemail. Arthur shifted carefully so as not to wake Lily and lifted the phone to his ear. He pressed play. Over the tinny speaker, he heard the chaotic background noise, the hiss of steam, the mechanical whine, and then Vivian's voice. "Arthur, please, I'm begging you." Arthur closed his eyes. The voice didn't sound like the woman in the pristine blouse who had dismissed his daughter's asthma as an excuse. It sounded like a woman who was bleeding out. "I'm sitting in the basement. I burned my hand. I'll give you a pension. I'll give you anything. Please, please come back." He lowered the phone. In his left pocket, nestled against his worn leather wallet, the solid brass valve sat heavy and cold. It weighed barely a pound, but right now, it felt like it was anchoring him to the floor. "Pendleton." Arthur jerked his head up. A tired-looking nurse in blue scrubs was standing by the swinging wooden doors, holding a clipboard. "Arthur Pendleton, we have a room for Lily." Arthur stood up immediately, shifting Lily's weight into his arms. She whimpered, burying her face into his worn flannel jacket. "Shh, it's okay, Bug. We're going in." He followed the nurse down a narrow, sterile hallway. The walls were painted a depressing shade of seafoam green, plastered with faded posters about hand-washing and flu shots. The examination room was small, dominated by a crinkling, paper-covered table. "Set her up here," the nurse said, typing onto a slow, outdated computer terminal. "Doctor will be right in. Her oxygen saturation was a bit low at intake. We'll probably need to do a nebulizer treatment." "Whatever she needs," Arthur said, smoothing Lily's hair back. My insurance is in a transition period. I was let go. I can pay cash, but I might need to set up a payment plan for the treatments." The nurse stopped typing and looked at him. Her eyes were sympathetic, but hardened by years of working in a chronically underfunded system. "Mr. Pendleton, a standard nebulizer treatment and a prescription for a rescue inhaler without insurance will run about $300 out of pocket. We require at least 50% up front." Arthur froze. $150. He had $14 in his checking account. He had a jar of loose change on his kitchen counter that might hold another 20. Arthur swallowed hard, the taste of cheap pancake syrup rising bitterly in his throat. "I can give you what I have today, and I'll bring the rest tomorrow, I swear to you." The nurse sighed, a long, weary sound. "I don't make the billing rules, sir. If it were up to me, but the clinic administration cracked down last month. We can do a basic checkup, but we can't dispense the medication or run the machine without the deposit." Arthur looked at his daughter. Her chest was heaving. Her small fingers clutched the fabric of his shirt. He was a man who fixed things. He patched pipes. He rewired motors. He stopped buildings from collapsing. But looking at his child gasping for air, he was completely, utterly powerless. He reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed against the cold brass of the pressure valve. $50. Vivian Croft had fired him to save $50. And now, for the lack of $150, his daughter was suffering. The absurdity of it all hit him like a physical blow. Miles away, a billionaire was sitting in a puddle of dirty water, watching $4 billion melt, begging him to save her. And here he was, standing in a sterile green room, begging a nurse for a breathing treatment he couldn't afford. Arthur pulled his phone out again. He looked at the voicemail icon. "I'll give you anything." He looked down at Lily. She looked up at him, her eyes glassy with fever, trusting him completely. She didn't care about servers, or Japanese investors, or corporate protocol. She just knew her dad always fixed things. Arthur made his choice. "Wait right here," Arthur said to the nurse, his voice suddenly hard, stripped of its previous exhaustion. The weariness evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharpened resolve. He walked out of the examination room, stepping into the chaotic hallway. He dialed the number back. It rang once before being snatched up. "Arthur!" Vivian gasped. Her voice was frantic, layered with the screaming background noise of the dying sub-basement. "You want me back, Ms. Croft?" Arthur asked, leaning against the cinder-block wall. "Yes, God, yes. Just tell me what to do. The pipe is slipping. The alarms are going off. We have less than a minute before total shutdown." "I have the part in my pocket," Arthur said evenly. "I can be there in 20 minutes. I know the override codes to bypass the failsafe. I can keep the servers alive while I hot swap the valve. But my price has gone up." "I told you anything," she screamed. 10,000, 50,000. "I don't want your money," Arthur said, watching a doctor walk past carrying a stack of files. "I want a wire transfer of $500,000 deposited into my account immediately, non-refundable, untaxable, and I want an open-ended premium health insurance policy for my daughter, paid in full by Croft Corps for the next 18 years. Dead silence on the line, save for the hissing steam. 500,000, Vivian stammered, the shock temporarily cutting through her panic. That's extortion." "No," Arthur replied, his voice deadly calm. "That's capitalism. You taught me the rules, Ms. Croft. Excuses are just inefficiencies dressed in emotion. My daughter needs medicine. Your company needs a brass valve. I have the supply. You have the demand. Do we have a deal, or do I hang up?" In the basement of the Croft Corps building, Vivian stared at her burned, blistered hand. The mainframe alarm switched from a rapid pulse to a solid, continuous wail. The final warning. "Deal," she whispered, a tear of pain and profound defeat slipping down her cheek, mixing with the grime on her face. "Deal, just hurry, 22 minutes. That was exactly how long it took for Arthur to sprint from the clinic, flag down a battered yellow cab, and throw his last $5 bill at the driver before the car even fully stopped at the curb. He shoved through the revolving glass doors of the Croft Corps lobby, leaving muddy footprints across the pristine Italian marble. Davis, the young security guard, stood up from his desk, his eyes wide, one hand resting uncertainly on his radio. "Arthur, man, you can't be in here. They're looking for—" "I know," Arthur interrupted, not breaking his stride as he bypassed the security turnstiles. "Call down to the sub-basement. Tell them to give me manual override access on the terminal, now." He didn't wait for Davis to respond. He hit the service elevator button. The descent felt agonizingly slow. Arthur gripped the brass valve in his pocket. It was room temperature, heavy, solid. It was the only real piece of leverage he had ever held in his entire life. When the metal doors slid open, a wall of suffocating, humid heat hit him. The sub-basement looked like the engine room of a sinking ship. The water on the floor was over an inch deep, swirling with rust and oil. The fluorescent lights were strobing violently, casting erratic shadows across the concrete. The noise was a physical weight, a deafening, high-pitched mechanical shriek that vibrated deep in his molars. Arthur waded into the room. Vivian was slumped against a structural pillar. Her posture, usually perfectly calibrated to project dominance, was completely broken. She sat in the filthy water, her silk blouse clinging transparently to her skin, her hair hanging in wet, tangled rat tails around her face. She was cradling her right arm against her chest. The skin across her wrist and forearm was an angry, blistering red, raw from the steam. She looked up as Arthur approached. There was no sneer, no cold, calculating stare, just a desperate, hollow exhaustion. "You came," she whispered. Her voice barely carried over the roar of the failing chiller. Arthur didn't answer her. He didn't offer his hand to help her up. He looked past her to the main coolant manifold. The daytime contractors were huddled near the back wall, terrified, completely paralyzed by a system they didn't understand. "Greg!" Arthur barked, marching towards the primary terminal. The IT director flinched, clutching his tablet like a life preserver. The core is at 99 degrees. We have 40 seconds before the hardware failsafe permanently kills the power. If it dies, the drives bake. Give me the terminal, Arthur demanded, shoving his wet sleeves up his forearms. Greg stepped back, letting Arthur take the keyboard. Arthur's fingers were thick and calloused, but they flew across the keys with practiced, desperate precision. He bypassed the automated safety protocols, manually commanding the software to ignore the thermal sensors. Warning, manual override engaged. Catastrophic hardware failure imminent. The synthetic voice echoed through the damp room. I bought us 3 minutes, Arthur said, turning away from the screen. But the pressure in the line is maxed out. If I unscrew that plastic valve, 200 pounds of boiling water is going to blow right into my chest. Miller, the contractor foreman, stepped forward, shaking his head. You can't hot swap that, man. It's suicide. The thread pressure alone will shear your skin off. I don't have a choice, Arthur muttered. He looked at Vivian. She was watching him, her face pale beneath the smears of grease. Get me a heavy canvas dropcloth and a pair of welding gloves, now! One of the contractors scrambled to a tool cage, returning seconds later with a heavy, dirty canvas tarp and thick leather gauntlets. Arthur pulled the gloves on. They were stiff, smelling of old sweat and burnt metal. He draped the heavy canvas over his head and shoulders, creating a makeshift blast shield. He stepped up to the screaming pipe. The heat radiating off the iron was intense, baking his face, pulling the moisture from his eyes. Through the thick leather of the gloves, he grabbed the cheap plastic valve. It was vibrating so hard, it blurred. Arthur pulled his heavy, scuffed craftsman wrench from his back pocket. He clamped the teeth of the wrench onto the base of the plastic valve. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the stifling, ozone-heavy air. He thought of Lily. He thought of the wet, rattling sound in her chest. He thought of the rigid, unforgiving plastic chair in the clinic. He jerked the wrench counterclockwise. The plastic valve gave way with a violent snap. Instantly, a jet of boiling, pressurized water exploded outward. The canvas tarp took the brunt of the blast, snapping back against Arthur's chest like a physical punch. Scalding steam billowed around him, searing his neck where the canvas didn't quite cover. He grunted in pain, squeezing his eyes shut, blindly holding his ground against the immense pressure. He dropped the broken plastic piece and fumbled in his pocket with his thick, clumsy gloves. He pulled out the solid brass valve. This was the dangerous part. He had to thread the brass perfectly onto the screaming, boiling iron pipe while fighting 200 pounds of outward pressure. If he cross-threaded it, the pipe would strip, the line would blow out completely, and the servers would melt. Arthur pushed forward. The boiling water hammered against his gloved hand, the heat penetrating the thick leather, burning his knuckles. He forced the brass valve against the opening. The water fought him, spraying wildly, soaking his jeans, burning his thighs. He twisted. The threads didn't catch. The water blasted him back. 30 seconds to critical core meltdown. The terminal announced mechanically. "Come on," Arthur gritted out, his teeth clamped together. He leaned his entire body weight into the pipe, ignoring the searing pain in his hands. He pressed the brass fitting flush against the iron and twisted hard. Metal scraped against metal, a harsh, grinding sound. The threads caught. Arthur didn't hesitate. He grabbed his wrench and cranked the brass valve down. 1 turn, 2 turns, 3. The deafening shriek of the escaping steam abruptly choked off, replaced by a low, powerful gurgle as the coolant flow slammed through the new, proper regulator. The violent shuddering of the heavy iron pipes smoothed out into a steady, rhythmic thrum. Arthur stumbled backward, ripping the wet canvas off his head. He pulled the soaked leather gloves off his hands. His knuckles were bright red, blistering rapidly from the steam. He was panting, his chest heaving, his clothes completely plastered to his body. Silence descended on the room. It wasn't completely quiet. The machinery still hummed, the water still dripped. But compared to the apocalyptic roar of the previous 10 minutes, it felt like a vacuum. "Greg," Arthur wheezed, leaning heavily against a dry wall. "Check the board." Greg stared at his tablet. His mouth hung open. Slowly, a shaky breath escaped his lips. "Temperature is dropping. 95, 90, 85. The liquid cooling is flooding Sector 4. The servers are stable. The algorithm is intact." A collective, shuddering sigh went through the room. The contractors slumped against the tool cages. Arthur looked down at his raw, throbbing hands. He was exhausted. A bone-deep, soul-crushing exhaustion that made his vision swim. He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel like a hero. He just wanted to go to sleep. He turned his head and looked at Vivian. She was still sitting in the dirty water. She was staring at the brass valve on the pipe. The piece of metal that cost $40. The piece of metal that just saved $4 billion. "The system is stable," Arthur said, his voice flat, devoid of any malice or triumph. He pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen was still cracked, but it functioned. "Now, we finalize the transaction." Numbers on a screen. That was all money had ever been to Vivian Croft. It was a metric of success, a scoreboard that proved she was smarter, faster, and more ruthless than the men who populated her world. But as she sat in the damp, foul-smelling water of the sub-basement, her ruined Louboutins pushed aside, her perspective shattered. The spreadsheet had failed her. The optimization matrix had almost destroyed her. Arthur walked over to her. He didn't loom. He just stood there, dripping wet, his hands burned, looking at her with an expression that was entirely transactional. "Greg," Vivian croaked. Her throat felt raw. "Bring me the tablet." Greg hesitated, looking at her blistered arm, then practically ran over, crouching beside her. He handed her the sleek, waterproof device. Vivian's hands were shaking violently. The pain in her right arm was a steady, agonizing throb, but the humiliation burned much hotter. She, the untouchable CEO, had been forced to her knees by her own arrogance. She navigated to the secure banking portal for Croft Corps' executive reserve. "Account details," she said, not looking up. Arthur read off his routing and account numbers from his cracked phone screen. He didn't stutter. He didn't hesitate. Vivian typed them in with her left hand. The interface asked for an authorization sum. She typed the number. 500,000. Please confirm direct wire transfer. She hovered her finger over the glowing blue button. $500,000. For a company valued at $4 billion, it was a negligible sum. But to Vivian, it was the heaviest ransom she had ever paid. It wasn't just money leaving her account. It was the total forfeiture of her absolute control. She pressed confirm. Transfer complete. "The insurance," Arthur reminded her quietly. "In writing, from HR." Vivian closed her eyes, fighting a wave of nausea. She opened her email client, drafted a direct, indisputable mandate to her head of human resources, authorizing a premium, zero-deductible family policy for Arthur Pendleton and his dependent, paid entirely by the corporation until the dependent reached the age of 18. She hit send. "It's done," she whispered, dropping the tablet onto the dry edge of the safety mat. "You have your money. You have your leverage. Are you satisfied?" Arthur looked at his phone. The banking app refreshed. Where there had once been $14, There was now a six-figure balance, a number so large it looked fake on his cracked screen. He didn't smile. He didn't feel a sudden rush of euphoria. What he felt was an overwhelming, crushing weight suddenly lifting off his chest. The constant, low-level panic of poverty, the fear of the next electric bill, the anxiety over a broken pair of shoes, the terrifying math of buying groceries, simply vanished. "I'm not satisfied, Ms. Croft," Arthur said softly. "I'm just tired." He turned away from her, walking toward the service elevator. He didn't look back. He didn't gloat. The doors opened, he stepped inside, and the metal walls closed, leaving Vivian alone with her IT director and a puddle of dirty water. 35 minutes later, Arthur walked back through the swinging wooden doors of the municipal clinic. The waiting room was still packed. The same sickly fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The air still smelled like ammonia. He walked past the rigid plastic chairs and straight to the reception desk. The tired nurse in the blue scrubs was still there, clicking her mouse. She looked up, her expression tightening slightly in anticipation of an argument. "Mr. Pendleton," she said softly, "I told you, I can't release the medication without the deposit. I'm sorry." Arthur pulled out his worn leather wallet. He didn't pull out the $14 in crumpled bills. He pulled out his debit card. "Run it for the full amount," Arthur said, sliding the plastic across the counter. "For the visit, for the nebulizer, for the rescue inhalers. Run it for the next 10 visits if you want." The nurse blinked, surprised by the sudden shift in his demeanor. She took the card, swiped it through the terminal, and punched in the $300 charge. She waited for the inevitable declined beep. The machine chirped happily. A long white receipt printed out. "Approved," she murmured, tearing the paper off. She looked at Arthur, a genuine smile breaking through her exhaustion. "I'll go get the machine set up." Arthur pushed open the door to the examination room. Lily was still sitting on the crinkly paper of the examination table, her small chest rising and falling with that painful, rattling wheeze. She looked tired, her eyes heavy. Arthur walked over to her. He didn't care that his clothes were damp, or that his knuckles were blistered and wrapped in temporary gauze he had grabbed from the security desk. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair. She smelled like cheap baby lotion and fever. "Daddy's here, Bug," he whispered, his voice finally breaking, a single hot tear slipping down his cheek. "Daddy fixed it." The nurse walked in, wheeling a small cart with a humming plastic machine. She placed the small plastic mask over Lily's face. A cool, thick mist began to pump into the mask. Lily took a deep, shuddering breath. The mist carried the medicine deep into her tight, inflamed lungs. Within seconds, the terrible, rattling wheeze began to smooth out. Her breathing slowed, becoming deeper, easier. The tension in her small shoulders melted away, and she leaned heavily against Arthur's chest. Arthur sat in the room, listening to the soft, rhythmic hum of the nebulizer. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. It was vastly superior to the shriek of industrial chillers or the hollow echo of a corporate boardroom. He closed his eyes, holding his daughter tight. He was unemployed. He was exhausted. He was covered in grime and minor burns. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of tomorrow. Victory tasted metallic and flat, like chewing on a piece of tin foil. Vivian sat on the edge of a stark white examination table in the private wing of Mount Sinai Hospital. A high-priced dermatologist was carefully wrapping her right forearm in thick, sterile gauze. The air in the room was aggressively filtered, smelling of rubbing alcohol and bleached cotton. It was a sharp, clinical contrast to the damp, rust-choked air of the sub-basement. But Vivian couldn't scrub the phantom stench of dirty water out of her nose. Takahashi Industries had signed the acquisition paperwork at 8 a.m. $4 billion. Her personal payout was astronomical. The wire transfer had cleared, the champagne had been popped by the board, and the press release was already circulating on financial networks. Yet, as she stared at the stark white bandage binding her blistered skin, she felt a profound, hollow nausea. "The second-degree burns will heal, Ms. Croft," the doctor murmured, taping the end of the bandage with practiced efficiency. "But the skin on the inner wrist is delicate. There will be permanent scarring. I can recommend a plastic surgeon for later laser mitigation." "No," Vivian said. Her voice was raspy, stripped of its usual commanding resonance. "Leave it." The doctor blinked, surprised, but nodded. He left the room, leaving her alone in the crushing silence. Vivian looked at her left hand. Her phone rested on the stainless steel counter. She opened her banking app. The numbers were staggering, a string of digits with commas that represented total, absolute power. But the numbers didn't make her feel safe anymore. When that plastic valve had snapped, when the boiling water had rushed toward her, her wealth had been utterly useless. $4 billion couldn't turn a wrench. $4 billion couldn't stop physics. She had spent her entire adult life insulating herself behind spreadsheets, algorithms, and glass walls, convincing herself that people were just variable costs. She had fired a man to save $50, and in doing so, she had nearly burned down her own empire. She pressed her good hand against her stomach, fighting a wave of physical sickness. The spreadsheet was perfectly balanced. She had won. But for the first time in her life, Vivian Croft felt completely, terrifyingly exposed. The illusion of her control was shattered, leaving behind a jagged, uncomfortable truth she could no longer ignore. Supermarket aisles at 10 in the morning were entirely foreign territory to Arthur. For 9 years, he had only seen grocery stores at 3 in the morning, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of security lights, rushing to buy discounted bread and expiring milk before his shift ended. Now the store was bright, chaotic, and smelled intensely of fresh roasted coffee and damp earth from the produce section. Arthur pushed a shopping cart down the center aisle. It wasn't the small, hand-held plastic basket he usually carried to strictly limit his purchases. It was the large, deep metal cart, and its wheels squeaked rhythmically against the polished linoleum. He stopped in front of the pediatric aisle. Rows of brightly colored bottles stared back at him. Lotions, body washes, diaper creams. For 4 years, Arthur had automatically reached for the bottom shelf. The generic store-brand bottles with flimsy plastic caps that smelled vaguely of chemical lavender. His hand hovered over the bottom shelf, out of pure muscle memory. Then he stopped. He looked up at the top shelf. There was a premium brand, oatmeal and honey infused, clinically proven for sensitive skin. It cost $12 a bottle, $9 more than the generic. $9 he would normally have to subtract from the heating bill or the gas tank. Arthur grabbed 3 bottles. He dropped them into the cart. They hit the metal wire with a heavy, satisfying thud. He didn't stop there. He walked to the fresh produce. He bought strawberries that weren't bruised. He bought thick cuts of steak. He bought a heavy woolen winter coat for Lily, letting his calloused fingers run over the thick, soft lining, feeling the absolute absence of frayed threads. When he finally reached the checkout counter, the belt was overflowing. The cashier, a bored teenager chewing gum, began scanning the items. Beep, beep, beep. With every electronic chirp, Arthur felt a phantom clench in his chest. His brain, hardwired for poverty, instinctively tried to calculate the running total. Bracing for the moment the number crossed the threshold of what he had in his account. "That'll be $342.16, the cashier mumbled, holding out a hand. Arthur's breath hitched. $300 on groceries. It was an offensive amount of money. It felt wrong, almost sinful, to spend that much on mere sustenance. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his debit card. His hand was shaking slightly. His knuckles, though healing, were still tight and pink from the steam burns. He slid the card into the chip reader. Approved. The machine spat out a long, white receipt. Arthur took it, staring at the black ink. He didn't check the remaining balance at the bottom. He knew it was over $499,000. But his brain couldn't process it. He pushed the heavy cart out through the automatic glass doors into the crisp November air. The wind bit at his face, but he didn't shiver. He loaded the brown paper bags into the trunk of his battered sedan. He sat in the driver's seat, gripping the worn leather steering wheel, listening to the engine idle. There was no crisis today. There was no leaking pipe, no eviction notice, no coughing fit that required a panicked trip to the clinic. There was just a Tuesday, a boring, ordinary Tuesday. Arthur put his head down against the steering wheel, inhaling the scent of the fresh strawberries sitting in the passenger seat, and let out a long, shuddering breath. He wasn't rich. In Vivian Croft's world, he was barely a rounding error. But in his world, he was untouchable. 6 months later, the spring thaw had finally broken the city's grey grip. In a high-rise condominium overlooking the park, Vivian Croft stood by the window. She wore a simple, unstructured cashmere sweater, the sleeves pushed up just enough to reveal the jagged, thick pink scar crawling across her right wrist. She was no longer the CEO of Croft Corp. Following the Takahashi acquisition, she had stepped down. The board had called it a strategic transition, but Vivian knew the truth. She couldn't walk into that building anymore. The smell of the filtered air made her nauseous. The sight of the maintenance staff in their blue uniforms made her chest tighten with an acute, inexplicable panic. She turned away from the window and walked into her sprawling, silent kitchen. She poured a cup of black coffee. The silence of the apartment was heavy. She had spent her life cultivating isolation as a form of dominance, pushing people away to maintain efficiency. Now the isolation wasn't a weapon, it was just a cage. She set the coffee down, accidentally clinking the ceramic mug against the granite countertop. The sharp noise echoed. Vivian traced the scar on her wrist with her thumb. It was rough, imperfect. A permanent reminder of the day she learned that power was not a number on a screen. Power was the people holding the tools. She had survived. She had won the deal, but the victory had fundamentally broken the woman she used to be. And looking around her perfectly sterile, perfectly empty penthouse, she realized she had absolutely no idea how to rebuild. Down in the park, miles away from the glass towers, the air smelled of wet soil and blooming cherry blossoms. Arthur sat on a wooden park bench. The wood was slightly damp from the morning dew, but he didn't care. He was wearing a thick, comfortable flannel shirt and a pair of new denim jeans. His hands rested on his knees. The blisters had healed, leaving small, shiny patches of new skin across his knuckles. He wasn't working. He had taken the money and quietly bought a small, 2-bedroom house in the suburbs outright. No mortgage, no rent. The remaining cash sat in a low-yield trust, generating just enough interest to cover utilities and food. He didn't buy sports cars or designer watches. He bought time. "Look, Dad." Arthur looked up. Lily was running across the damp grass. She was wearing a bright yellow raincoat and matching rubber boots. She was chasing a stray dog, laughing loudly. Arthur listened. He didn't hear a wet, rattling wheeze. He didn't hear the terrifying struggle for oxygen. He just heard the clear, piercing sound of a healthy child laughing. The premium healthcare policy Vivian had signed off on had provided Lily with a top-tier pediatric pulmonologist. The daily preventative inhalers kept her airways perfectly clear. Lily ran back to him, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold air, her chest heaving naturally. She crashed into his legs, wrapping her small arms around his knees. "I'm hungry," she announced, looking up at him with bright, clear eyes. Arthur smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile that reached the corners of his eyes, erasing years of the deep, exhausted grooves carved into his face. He reached out, his rough thumb gently wiping a speck of dirt from her cheek. "Pancakes?" he asked. "With the real syrup," Lily demanded, bouncing on her toes. "Not the fake plastic kind." "The real kind," Arthur agreed, standing up. "Only the real kind." He took her small hand in his large, scarred one. They walked out of the park, their boots crunching softly on the gravel path. Arthur didn't look back at the distant skyline. He didn't think about servers or valves or the billionaire who had tried to crush him. He simply felt the solid weight of his daughter's hand in his, smelling the damp earth, moving forward into a quiet, unremarkable, and profoundly beautiful day. True power isn't measured by the balance of a bank account, but by the hands that keep the world turning while the elite look the other way. If Arthur's raw, unfiltered journey from a discarded number on a spreadsheet to a man holding the ultimate leverage resonated with you, hit that like button right now. We tell deeply human, grounded stories here. No corporate fluff, just the grit of reality. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a drop. What would you have done in Arthur's shoes? Take the money or let it burn? Leave your thoughts in the comments below.